Welcome everyone, Costin here with the discussion about Total War Warhammer 3, about the hardest campaign starts in the entire game. Not the hardest campaigns, not the hardest legendary lords to play, but just the hardest starts that you can have playing a campaign in Total War Warhammer 3. At the very beginning of this list, we have the Daemon Prince. Believe it or not, I was actually not considering including him in this list because he doesn't necessarily have very hard enemies to deal with at the start. Generally, when you think about including a campaign here, they either have to fight very difficult battles that can be really annoying, and they don't necessarily have the armies for it. The Daemon Prince is in a category of his own, where he does have armies to deal with. He can get some pretty good units. The Vote and Marauders of Slaanesh are actually some of your best. They do have anti-infantry, they are meat shield, they are shielded. You can get Blue Horrors of Tzeentch. You do start with some demonic units. However, although you do start with that, and you can recruit those things from pretty early on, and the enemies you have early on are just a minor faction of Nurgle, a minor faction of Tzeentch, the problem with the Daemon Prince is that his campaign mechanics, and the campaign mechanics of all the demons that cast in general, are just awful right now. In particular, if you have a province that's not suited to your corruption. So for instance, I start here, this is a Nurgle province. It has a ridiculous amount of Nurgle corruption, and the problem is that's interfering with the Chaos Undivided corruption, which my faction uses. Now, your corruption, be it Slaanesh, Nurgle, Khorne, Tzeentch, or Undivided in this case, is what's going to dictate your public order. It's something you need in order to maintain control of your provinces. But you don't have that because you're in a Nurgle province. The province next door is a Tzeentch province. Sure, you could head down to Norska to find provinces with a lot of Chaos Undivided corruption that you'd be able to take out with ease. But that would mean, of course, abandoning your initial province and dealing with that. You don't necessarily have powerful enemies to deal with unless Malice Darkblade over here does decide to declare war against you. But the problem with the Daemon Prince is that he is incredibly slow. This is turn 15, and I've only taken 2 entire provinces, and there's still enemies to deal with. There's an army of Tzeentch that is running away right here. They've been taking settlements. I took the Mac. There's an army of the Varg, which is coming for me. I'll be able to beat them back, but they're probably going to take one of the settlements that I do have. So it is an incredibly slow and harsh campaign start. It's slow because your economy in particular only generates 100 income for these level 1 settlements. Another issue is with regards to sacking and looting settlements. When you attack a settlement, you have either the option to dedicate it to a particular god, or you can sack it. Now, sacking obviously will generate a decent amount of money, but if you sack it and then occupy it, you won't gain any real points towards dedication. So you're just ending up screwing yourself because you need points for to dedicate to gods, to unlock units, to unlock body parts, which is one of the main components of playing the Daemon Prince. So for instance, if I dedicate to Khorne, I get Khorne corruption to all provinces. If I dedicate to Nurgle, I get Nurgle corruption. I get various benefits, but you need to be able to dedicate to those gods. But you're not going to be able to do that if you're sacking every settlement because the amount of points you're getting will be very low. If you fight a lot of field battles, which can be quite rare in Warhammer 3, you will gain a lot of dedication points, but battles are not very common in Warhammer 3. This is really a faction that was in a bad spot even in the Realms of Chaos campaign, and it is in a much worse start in overall situation in Immortal Empires. What do they need? They need better ways of handling the public order. They need better ways of dealing with their economy so they can get a lot of units. And another issue is if you dedicate to anyone but Slaanesh or Tzeentch, like if you dedicate Khorne or to Khorne, for instance, all you're gonna get are Marauders of Khorne. But you need the DLC, the Champions of Chaos DLC, to get it. Now, here's my question. Why in the world would I play the Daemon Prince when I can play a Warriors of Chaos campaign? Play Be'lakor. If you want the demonic army, play Be'lakor. You can get a full-on demonic army much easier than you can as the Daemon Prince. He is a vastly superior force than the Daemon Prince. The Daemon Prince is just awful. And he's one of the worst campaigns in the game right now, and he certainly has one of the harshest and hardest starts in the game at the moment. And number 4, we have Settra the Imperishable, the Tomb Kings. The Tomb Kings are a race that starts off very slow because they only get one army, their initial one. They only have one army capacity, one lord capacity, if you will, from the very start. Now, you can increase this with either research by going with a dynasty, though this will take 14 turns to do, or you can do it for the mortuary cult for 10,000 gold, which isn't necessarily going to be as much of a problem as you might think, but 10,000 gold and 800 canopic jars. By the way, that increases, like it gets to 1,600 canopic jars if you want to increase that again. So getting a second army can be very difficult. This is actually far more significant for an early game than you might believe, because the second army can secure your borders, can secure trouble spots, can prevent an enemy from flanking you. Put an army in Khemri, or put an army in some of the territories you're going to take early on, so that your enemies from the north, or potential enemies from the north, like Skarbrand, who, if I toggle the fog of war, starts right over here, and he is almost certainly going to declare war against you, so that he can't just raid Numas after you take it, and you're dealing with issues in the south. That is the first problem, and it is a very big one in the early game, because although the Tomb Kings get free recruitment for all of their units, they can't get more than one army from the start. And by the way, this also applies to heroes. You start with 0 hero capacity. Starting a campaign with no heroes and not having the capacity to get them for 14, 15, 16 turns is a really harsh one. The Tomb Kings have a great deal of power in the mid-late game, because once you do unlock those armies, once you do unlock the unit capacity for those armies, things do get better. That's another thing, by the way. Tomb Kings, to recruit more than just skeletal warriors and skeletal spearmen, do need to get barracks, special buildings to get those really good units, like Necrosphinxes, War Sphinxes, etc. So you need a vast empire to maintain a large quantity of units. It does eventually work out in the end, but man, is that campaign start really harsh. And it's particularly harsh if you are playing as Settra. See, if you're playing another Tomb Kings faction, you are going to be in a much better position to have a space to be able to grow, get your research done, get your army capacity, get your structures done. But if you play as Settra, you're not going to get that luxury. The Southlands was considered the Thunderdome before the launch of Warhammer 3, and you're pretty much in the middle of the Thunderdome. You're actually in, from my perspective, the worst position in the Thunderdome, because Khemri, to the north, you have the Savage Orcs, which are almost certainly going to declare war against you. Then you have Malagor further to the north. Then you have Skarbrand. Then you have Forek to your east. You have Manfred to your south, and you have Volkmar. All of these factions are quite very likely to declare war against you. To your west, you have Arkhan and Rapans. And while Rapans has one of the best campaign starts, because she can secure the entirety of Araby, have a really safe and secure province, and you can get it eventually as Settra. Or you can vassalize Rapans, which is one of the things I've done in my campaign, and give her the west. Although you can certainly do that, etc., you're going to be fighting for your entire province. In the first 2 turns of your campaign, if you want to be effective, you're going to be fighting against Numas. Take Numas out very, very quickly. Take out their army, take their settlement, take Qatar. Within 2 turns. And then 4 turns, you also get to fight a full-on stack with a Terrorgeist over here in the Springs of Eternal Life. It is a brutal campaign start, having to fight 3 settlement battles within the first 4 turns, and a full stack alongside that, along with a field battle that isn't necessarily the easiest in the world, though you do have a better army. You only start with, the only good units that you have are 2 Tomb Guards and 2 Skeletal Archer chariots. And those chariots aren't especially great, to be quite honest, and though chariots can be pretty strong. Though their power is mitigated by the fact that you are going to be fighting a number of settlement battles, and that's just the first few turns. Then you get Manfred to the south, followed up by Volkmar, followed up quite likely by the Wood Elves, by Forek, and then by the Lizardmen of Tic-Tac-Toe, who actually has a really strong counter against you with his bomber units. So regardless of how you cut it, you have very powerful enemies surrounding you. You can win it. The problem is you just don't have the flexibility to respond to all these threats at the same time, because it's going to take you a long time to be able to get more than 1 army. And even with 2 armies, it's not quite enough. Like, I would love to maintain an army in one settlement that just has a couple of units. But with the Tomb Kings, it's all or nothing. Either you get a full stack of skeletal warriors and spearmen, or you get nothing at all. And there lies the problem, that lack of early game flexibility that the Tomb Kings have. Now, it isn't as big of a problem for other campaigns, but it is a major problem if you are playing as Settra. That lack of flexibility. Now, Settra is probably the strongest Tomb King legendary lord. He does have a lot of powerful bonuses in his skill tree. And he can gain quite a lot in terms of control, in terms of hero capacity for Tomb Princes, hero recruit rank for Tomb Princes, unit capacity, etc. So he does have some significant bonuses to his faction. And once you get going in real style, but it's going to take you dozens of turns to really unlock the full potential of the Tomb Kings, whereas other factions may unlock that much earlier. It is a hard start. Do expect to fight a lot of battles early on, and do expect to be generally outnumbered by the enemy. I think just having, like, what would really help for the Tomb Kings is just starting with one extra army capacity would be a godsend for them, would make their campaigns, or at least give Settra that extra army capacity. I'm not sure if the other Tomb Kings legendary lords need it, but give Settra that extra army capacity, his campaign would be much, much better than what he currently has. Because having only one army capacity when the AI regularly recruits 2+ armies, as pretty much any faction, means that you're generally going to be fighting outnumbered. And you're not necessarily going to have the units to deal with them. There are a lot of upsides to the Tomb Kings, but Settra just starts in a really harsh position. And number 3, we have Karl Franz, the Empire. The Empire is in something of a rough state in Immortal Empires, regardless of the legendary lord you are playing. Why is that? Well, because the Empire, they're more of a growing faction. They're a faction that gets quite a bit stronger later in the game, with heroes, mages, warrior priests, witch hunters, captains. They do have quite a lot on offer. And if we look at the building browser, yeah, you can get a lot of mages, you can get some really powerful cavalry, and there's very few things quite like a doom stack of Hellstorm rocket batteries, demigryphs, handgunners, and greatswords in the late game, supported of course by heroes. However, the Empire does have a rough start, in particular if you don't own the DLC, which is the Beast and the Hunter, because the Beast and the Hunter gives you access to recruiting archers from any settlement. And archers are really cheap units, and they're really good early game units. So if you don't have a DLC, you're going to be in a rough position. But even with the DLC, Karl Franz is still in a really, really bad position from the start, because his initial campaign challenge is dealing with the Imperial Secessionists, who hold most of Reichland, which wouldn't be too big of a problem, but they also hold Helmgart, which is an issue, because this is a fortified settlement that can be difficult to take. Like here, the garrison itself is 14 units. Now, can you deal with that? Absolutely. In fact, I have a video on this channel where I deal with this by turn 6, pretty much. You can deal with it by turn 5. You can take out the Imperial Secessionist by turn 5. But that's 5-6 turns of your campaign where you're going to be fighting a lot of manual battles, or you'll get enough units to auto-resolve this. The only 2 battles you really have to fight are this one initially, and then for Grunberg. After that, if you get enough troops, and you can use global recruitment to get a lot of troops to take the other settlements. And you do want to hurry, because if you don't hurry, Marienburg is quite likely to go for Eilhart. A lot of people say, oh, Bretonnia goes for Marienburg. I haven't seen that in any of my legendary campaigns. Maybe it's a legendary thing because all the factions get significant bonuses, so maybe Bretonnia isn't quite as capable of taking Marienburg if you're playing on legendary as it would be on a lower difficulty, because the initial army that Leoncourt starts with, its power is diminished when you are playing as on legendary. By the way, that's the start of your campaign. That's not the issue. There are plenty of harsh campaign starts where you have to fight a lot of battles. That isn't the problem. But it is part of it, because you're wasting 6 turns when really the entire empire is burning all around you, and you really are the only one who can stop that from happening. The AI elector counts are going to be awful. But then we get into the problems that the imperial system has. You can't make defensive alliances, military alliances. You can't use the allegiance system with elector counts. You can declare war on them, but you lose imperial authority. You already start at 0, so you're going to have -5 growth to all provinces. This isn't too big of an issue, however, to be honest, because you have pretty decent growth as the empire. However, if you start losing more than that, if you're at -2, you lose -5% income, and your elector counts can't lose fealty. If fealty gets 0, yeah, it's they're gonna go to war. Problems. And if you get to -7, you're losing 4 control to all provinces, and -4, it's -2 control to all provinces. So yeah, things can get really nasty. You start with 100 prestige, and you start with 0 imperial authority, and both of these are faction resources, both imperial authority. You want to maintain imperial authority in the plus for growth, income, and to increase the elector count fealty so you can eventually confederate them. Is not a great system. It really needs some updates. The dilemmas need some updates as well, because the dilemmas essentially boil down to, if you don't have enough prestige or imperial authority or both, chances are you can get screwed. Maybe a civil war happens between in your empire, or maybe two elector counts go to war with each other and you don't have the resources to stop that. But that's not the biggest issue, nor the fact that you will get random AI armies to spawn to attack certain elector count held settlements, and you have to either spend 1,000 prestige or 2,000 gold to deal with that. But all of that is manageable. What isn't manageable is the current state of the empire. The empire is under a great deal of threat. A lot of the elector counts are basically designed to be consumed by other legendary lords. Ostermark, for instance, is designed to be consumed by Draika over here, who starts with one of the strongest early game armies in the entire game. There's nothing quite like Draika's tree army, and it's not just Draika that's the issue, though she's likely going to go to war against Ostermark. Also, Azak the Slaughterer here in the mountains quite likely will either descend on Kislev or Ostermark and just finish the job. So Ostermark can be consumed pretty quickly. Stirland or Averland, or both, are under threat from Vlad, who is a powerhouse of a faction. Nuln is under threat from Durfo. He has a hard-on for going to war against the dwarves, and once he's finished with the dwarves, he quite likely will declare war against Nuln. And he's not quite on the same level of Draika, but he also has a Tree Spirit army, and those Tree Spirits, the Tree Kin, the Tree Men, they're very scary to deal with in a campaign, because they're really resistant towards ranged armies, and they also, the Tree Kin also generate fear, so you're gonna have leadership issues. If you go against Urfu or Draika, though, and you may end up fighting both if you're playing as Karl Franz early on, more likely Draika, to be honest with you. But the problem you're quite likely to encounter is that your early game army is just going to get annihilated in an open field battle against Durfo. If you can corner them in a settlement, that is a much better situation than if you have to fight them in the open. Though chances are Durfo at least is going to be held up trying to conquer the dwarves. For whatever reason, the AI doesn't really like taking major settlements, even if they have all the capability to do so. And then that's just 4 potential threats. Potential and quite likely. So Durfu, Draika, Vlad, Azak, yeah, threatening 3 or 4 of the elector counts to the east or south. But there's more. Of course, you can end up in a war with Marienburg. One of the reasons you want to take Eilhart so quickly is Marienburg can snatch it up if you're not fast enough. And you may end up in a war with Marienburg, which you don't want, because if you end up in a war with Marienburg, then it means they're not holding back the tides of the Norskins that are going to descend on you. You really don't want to take control of the wasteland, because it is going to be under threat, and you've got a lot of issues to deal with. A certain issue that you are going to have to deal with in every campaign is the issue of Festus the Leech Lord. Festus starts over here, and he's supposed to decimate Hockland. He likely will within the very first few turns, and you're going to lose. You used to lose 3 Imperial Authority. I think you lose 1 right now. They nerfed. They made it easier to deal with that, but you're still losing 1 Imperial Authority, and that is already a problem. And never mind that Festus is quite likely to go to war with Midland or with Ostland, or both. That Kislev is quite likely to take large chunks of Ostland. I've seen that happen in pretty much every campaign. Hell, I've seen Kislev outright conquer Ostland. Then there's Khazrak and the orcs over here, especially Khazrak, who's going to take good chunks of Midland, though you can generally save Midland from being consumed. Now, here's the issue. Every single electro count that gets completely destroyed, except Hochland, loses you free Imperial authority. At -10, you get the Civil War. All electro counts declare war on you. And you lose -4 control to all provinces, -8 growth. You're screwed in an enormous number of ways if that ends up happening. And Hochland is going to fall, so that's going to be -1. Osland may fall, that's -4 if both those happen. If Ostermark falls, that's -7. And so you can generally get to -7 within like the first 10, 20 turns of a campaign. It doesn't usually happen, but it can happen. So your campaign can go horribly wrong very, very quickly, and there's very little you can do about it. -7. And so if Midland were to be wiped out, or Nuln were to be wiped out, then you would be in a civil war. And you can't control it. All you can do is pray that the RNG is going to fall in your favor and you're not going to have the issues. People have reported, like, there are comments of people saying that this happens. I'm not sure what difficulty it's happened. I haven't seen this so far. But it can happen. The possibility is there. Or Osland could be wiped out by Kislev. And forget Nuln. Forget Durfa going unknown. What about if Katarin just decides, I'm going to take the gold mine that Osland holds? What if that happens? That's -3 in itself. That is a lot that you can lose. Like, Hochland is -1. Ostermark, you get -4. Osland, -7. And if another one, and if Midland or Nuln falls, in that case, you're in a civil war situation, and very, very, very little to deal with it. Oh, let's not ignore the situation with Norland potentially falling to the tides of the Norskans that are going to descend from the north. Let's not ignore that particular issue that can and likely will happen. So yeah, a lot of problems that Franz has to deal with, and he's already wasting a good chunk of his early game. Like, the early game, from my perspective, is the first 20 turns or so. He's going to spend a lot of chunk of the early game just dealing with these secessionists and then rushing to liberate Hochland. You can stabilize the situation, but it is a miserable start, regardless of how you cut it. I think he needs to start with more Imperial prestige. Like, start with 1,000 Imperial prestige. 1 Imperial authority, things would be a lot better. Or 2 Imperial authority. If Festus is always going to wipe out Hochland, just give us some Imperial authority. Give us a better situation. If the Empire burns to the ground, fine, but at least give us the tools, creative assembly, so we can potentially prevent that from happening. Because all the stuff that I've talked about, it's just the early game issues. Late game, it's wonderful. The late game, maybe the dwarves decide, we're going to go to war against you. Maybe Vlad goes on a whole vampire crusade against you. Maybe Azag wipes out the dwarves and descends full force from the mountains. Maybe you get Skarsnik to descend from the mountains from the east. Maybe Wolfric and Trog descend from Norska. Maybe Be'lakor decides to take a big chunk of the empire. Oh yeah, it gets even better and better. You have a vast swath of territory that you need to try and protect in some way, shape, or form. That's always an issue in any campaign, and it's vulnerable from all sides. Therein lies the issue. Oh, I haven't even mentioned the fact that to the south you have Grom the Punch, and he's quite likely going to make a beeline for Helmgart and attack it. You can hold it, but that's another problem. On top of all of that, within the early game, you're also going to get the Greenskins coming for you. Never mind Kemmler or the Wood Elves or anything like that. No, Grom is going to come for you, and Grom is scary to generally deal with, especially if he ends up declaring a war against someone or against you. That would be the perfect situation to cap it off. Things can go horribly, horribly wrong very, very quickly in a campaign, and you don't have any control whatsoever around this. It's a similar situation to the dwarves, by the way, who, regardless of what you do, have to deal with the grudge meter. The reason I've decided not to include any of the dwarven campaigns is I do generally think that is broken, and they need to fix that. The Empire needs more than just a fix to their imperial system. It needs some changes some campaign changes to the start position. Maybe you control maybe you control Eilhard, maybe you control Helmgart from the start. Maybe they don't get that from the start, and you just have to liberate the Reichland yourself. Like if they gave Helmgart to Karl Franz from the start, that would be a much, much better position to go with than it is currently. But yeah, the Empire needs some help. So do the dwarves, but right now they're just too big of a mess, and I don't want to add the dwarves on this list because I hope that they're going to be fixed soon enough. If they fix the grudge meter, the dwarves will be in a much better position. The Empire won't necessarily be with easy fixes. At number 2, it would be Prince Imrik of Caledor. The High Elves, like the Empire, are a race that starts out a bit weak, but gets stronger later on. The High Elves do get some significant benefits if they can trade. So their entire early game economy does rely on them making diplomatic relations, getting military access, getting trade agreements with fellow partners. However, as Imrik, you can't do that. You don't have any trading partners, which sets you apart from every other High Elven Lord in the game. Well, maybe Alifanar, though he can certainly get trade agreements going soon enough in his campaign if he so decides with the rest of Ulthuan. So that is a big problem in itself because it means even maintaining a stack of troops, a full-on army, is going to be an issue. Imrik also struggles because his entire campaign style was far more well-suited for Warhammer 2 than Warhammer 3. See, in Warhammer 2, it was really about building one really powerful army early on, and then building potentially more armies in the mid to late game. Imrik has the potential of getting a really good, strong army. He does start with Dragon Princes, he does start with the Dragon, he does start with a Fire Mage, so that is a good army that you can get. The problem is this is no longer Warhammer 2, this is Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, where being able to get multiple armies from the very start is actually significant. This is an issue that does affect all the High Elves to a degree or another. But Imrik certainly has the worst situation, and that's just the economic problem. Then we have to talk about his campaign situation. He gets a quest, turn 2, not turn 1, turn 2, to confederate to Caledor. But to confederate to Caledor, you need to take, occupy, sack, or raise 6 different settlements. You can cheese it and basically get 4 in your initial province, like you wait until turn 2, you sack the Bone Gulch in turn 2, then you get another lord from the fortress, and then you, on turn 3, you occupy the Bone Gulch with that lord, and then you repeat that process, because if you do use different actions on different lords in different turns, you can get it done. But yeah, there's a lot of hoops to jump through the early game in order to confederate with Caledor to be able to get vision with other elven factions and trade with them. His Mortal Empires campaign was one of the harshest campaign starts because he couldn't trade by default. You can at least trade with them with factions in Immortal Empires, but yeah, your first few turns in the campaign are generally going to be miserable. And that's just the first few turns. Let's not even talk about what happens until turn 20. So Imrik starts the war with Clan Helheim. That's not too big of an issue, but let's look at where he starts. Queek Headtaker is here in the Misty Mountains. He's quite likely to declare war against you by the time the first 20 turns are over. The problem is you can't really expand over here in the Broken Teeth to go meet Queek because this element in particular, Nagashisar, is held by a really powerful Skaven faction. They're passive, thankfully. If they were active, they would beat the crap out of you, but yeah, if I'm not mistaken, they have a tier 5 settlement, so you can't really take that over with any early game army that you have. Later on, yeah, that's a different discussion, but that means you can't expand here to go meet Queek, and maybe you wouldn't want to meet Queek because then you'd run into Scarbrand, you'd run into Orcs, you'd run into a lot of issues. You don't have any allies from the start because the only friendly quote-unquote factions you have are the dwarves here of Karak Azul, and they're not necessarily going to be in a position where they want to maintain good diplomatic relations with you. To the east, you have Ogres and you have Gorst, which is another nightmare to deal with. And Gorst himself is quite likely to declare war against you. And it's not just Gorst, it's also Greasus, or the Darkland Orcs that are here to the north. They're also another problem for you to deal with, though it is potentially a problem that you can manage. The biggest early game issue is going to be Craventail. Now, Craventail is a crap legendary lord, but the Skaven are a genuine nightmare to deal with, especially on a high difficulty, because on Legendary, for instance, every single Skaven faction, big or minor, they're going to assemble at least 2 stacks of troops, or 2.5 stacks of troops of crappy units, but they're just going to swarm you in numbers. They're going to get a lot of advantages in battles because they're just going to overwhelm you or going to run out of ammunition on your archers. You can beat it, but yeah, it is harsh beating Craventail. I've done a whole guide, early campaign guide as Imrik. It can either go faster than that guide or it can go slower. It depends on what Craventail does. Like, the basic idea is confederate to Calidor as quickly as possible, then go into the Desolation, take the Darkhold, wait for Quake to wipe out the Moon Howlers, and then take advantage of that and take Mount Greyhag while he's still in it and recovering, and then wipe him out. But it took me about until turn 20 to do that, and I ended up in a war with Quake. And I'm in some issues. Like, I was in some issues in campaign. That was probably a bad example, but a lot of things can go wrong very quickly in that campaign. You can be overwhelmed by Skaven. You can end up fighting war on 2 fronts. Like, you can't ignore Craventail, because if you ignore Craventail, he's going to declare war on you, and then Queek is going to declare war on you, and you're just going to be sandwiched between 2 legendary lords. One crap, but another one not so bad. Not so crap. It was already bad enough in Immortal Empires because you were fighting Snitch. Thankfully, you no longer have to deal with Snitch and his ninja bullshit, but it is still a rough situation to start as Imrik with all the enemies he has. The problem is he just doesn't have resources. His economy is not that great. He starts with the tier 2 settlement that can get a good amount of economy at tier 3, but getting to tier 3, that building requires 6,000 gold to do it. It's gonna take 20 turns, well, less likely, to be able to make the money back that you're spending to get this Tower of the Bloody Tooth. So you are certainly going to have some significant issues playing as Imrik in the early game. And that's why it earns its spot on this list as one of the harshest campaign starts. But it's not just the early game, it's also the mid game, the late game. You have it. What do I think needs to happen to Imrik? Well, I think he needs to get the Elfarian treatment. What do I mean by that? Well, Elfarian also is a guy whose core territory, or his home territory, so to speak, is in Ulf 1. Though unlike you, he actually starts with his core territory. He doesn't control it fully, but he starts with Tor of Res. And once he fights a battle, takes the settlement of Mongol, he starts with an army right outside of it. But once he takes this, he gets an option. He can either keep Tor of Res and get a significant amount of influence, and then maybe sell Tor of Res later to someone. I'm not sure how that will work to your campaign, because one of your objectives to winning as Elfarian is to get Tor of Res to a high level. So I'm not sure how that will work. Or he can keep Tor of Res for himself. But if he gives Tor of Res, he gets 25,000 gold. As Imrik, you have to pay influence to get Calidor, or you can get it for free, but you lose diplomatic relations with your fellow elves, which you don't want that to happen because you want to maintain good relations with them to have trade agreements with them. It's going to significantly impact your economy, so you need to gain a good amount of influence as Imrik to be able to confederate with Calidor properly, and you need to confederate Calidor to get vision to the other elven factions in order to be able to trade with them. So I would say giving him the Elfarian treatment, like having him start with Calidor, would be a much better situation, and giving him that choice. Like, even if you start a war with Noctilus, you wouldn't care. But having Imrik, if you are playing him, start with Calidor, would be a much better situation, even if he has to make the same kind of choice as Elfarian. But if he had that, like that choice between a lot of influence or a lot of money, that would be better. Hell, if he started with Calidor and he could gain a significant amount of influence, then he could sell Calidor to Tyrion. That's exactly what I did. When I did confederate with Calidor eventually in my Emmer campaign, I just sold Calidor to Tyrion, got a lot of money from that, about 10k, so you can gain some money with Emmerich, but it can take time and it can slow you down in a fairly significant fashion. It's just a really harsh campaign start. It's always been a harsh campaign, and with a really miserable start, and that hasn't changed in Immortal Empires. Just giving Imrik better tools to deal with the problems from the early game would vastly improve his campaign and make it that much better. As it stands, he's one of the hardest and slowest legendary lords to get going in the game. Like, he's almost as slow as the Daemon Prince, And he has a much harder situation to deal with initially than Daemon Prince, because he's fighting dwarves and then he's fighting Skaven, and Skaven are generally a nightmare to deal with, on Legendary in particular. And he doesn't have the economy to support a lot of armies from the start. That is how the Elves are designed. Their faction gets incredibly strong economically, militarily, what have you, later on, but early on they do struggle quite a bit. The other lords don't struggle because they have either the ability to get trade from the very start, or they get a significant amount of money as Elfarian, or both really, as Elfarian. Who, just to be clear, Elfarian has a hard campaign, but it's a fun campaign because he at least has the tools to deal with that. It is a hard campaign. Imrik is worse off, I would say, than that. And consider the fact that Elfarian starts over here and he's gonna fight Warzag and Skarbrand and Mulgore. Yeah, that is harsh. But you don't. But another thing to be said about Elfarian is that, in spite of all of that, you can just decide, you know, I don't care about the Badlands. I don't need to care about the Badlands. I can just go home, conquer Evres, get that influence, disband your army here off the coast, or try and make it back with it to Ulthuan, conquer the territories of Ulthuan, deal with Nakari, set up a home base of operations there, eventually come back to the Badlands if you so desire, but not necessarily start with it. And there's flexibility there. Imrik doesn't have that luxury. And that's why he's a really hard start. Now, number one, in terms of the hardest campaign starts in Total War Warhammer 3, we have Tzarina, Katarin of Kislev. Of course, Katarin was going to be at the number one spot on this list. I would love to play a Kislev campaign that didn't feel like complete misery. You can play one as Boris, though he does have issues because he can't benefit from the significant public order benefits that Katarin or Castalton get from dealing with the supporter race, so to speak, between each other. But Boris is in an okay spot. If you abandon his initial province, if you fight in that initial province, things are going to be much worse. But what makes Katarin bad? Well, Kislev has issues with its roster. She can only recruit on turn 1 and for quite a decent amount of time after that, because she can't get Kislev to level 2 for quite a good number of turns. But Katarin can only recruit either Kossars or Kossars with spears. That's it. They're okay, but they're weak against armor, and they're not the best units in the game. Like, they're a hybrid unit between ranged and melee, and they're not especially great at either of them. Though they're better in ranged than in melee. So your army, your possibilities of recruitment in early game are going to be more limited. Imrik may have a hard start, but you at least have elven archers and a bloody dragon. And a hero, a fire mage. You don't get that. You get Katarin, who isn't a great melee combatant, who isn't a great caster. She has ice magic, but you're not going to be able to improve her ice magic because you need to spend points in other skills. And you can't get a mage for a good number of turns because you need research to be able to unlock the slots to train that, and it's going to take quite a few turns to do so. She also doesn't have one of the most powerful things Kislev has in terms of heroes, which is a Patriarch. Castalton and Boris do start with a Patriarch, so they get significant casualty replenishment and a good melee combatant. That's something Katarin herself desperately needs. Or she needs to be able to get an Ice Mage from much earlier on. Or start with Tempest Mage specifically much earlier on. Her starting army is also pretty weak, especially considering what you're dealing with. This army right here that she starts a war with, her initial army to deal with, and this army here under Elric, they both have mammoths and Norscan ice trolls. Those are pretty good units, and honestly, they're better than anything else you have in your own army, with the exception of the Ice Guard with swords. Can you win these battles? Yes. Can you get past the challenge of dealing with the Bjorslings? Yes. Within a couple of turns. But you are wasting a couple of turns just dealing with an initial faction, and meanwhile everything else is going to go to hell around you. Because here's the problem. To the north, you have Frodon Clean. He's almost certainly going to wipe out the Druzine Enclave, though that's not necessarily bad. But like with Skaven in general, he's going to get at least 2, maybe 2.5 stacks of troops very quickly when he's being played by legendary AI. in particular. So that is a nightmare in itself. Yes, I am considering this list purely on the basis of how things are on Legendary. I'm not considering lower difficulties. But it is still pretty harsh on lower difficulties as well, I imagine. But yeah, he's going to wipe out the Tzarina Enclave, Troll Country, and then he's likely to declare war against you. So 2 Skaven stacks of troops coming right up. And he can and like with Imrik, the Skaven can absolutely overwhelm you in numbers. Can you deal with that? Oh yeah, but a hard start nonetheless. Then you have Azazel. Azazel is supposed to be countered by Castalton. Azazel has a much more powerful army than Castalton. He's going to wipe out the Brotherhood of the Bear pretty quickly, and then he's going to destroy Castalton's armies again and again and again. If you're playing Castalton, it isn't too bad of a situation because you can bait Azazel in a fight he can't win because before he becomes too powerful. Take Azazel out, take his fortress out, give it to the Brotherhood of the Bear before they get wiped out, and have them protect your northern flank while you deal with Frot and then deal with Trog. So, as Katarin, regardless of what you're going to be doing, you're going to be fighting Frot and you're going to likely be fighting Azazel. Whether or not Azazel would come all the way here early on, that is a different matter. But you're also going to be at war with Trog. Trog gains pretty much an entire province over here in the Mountains of Hell on turn 1. Like, he takes out this army, then he confederates with them, gets the Forbidden Citadel, gets the Altar of Spawn without having to fight the minor settlement battles and the frustration that ensues. Then he takes the Winter Pyre on turn 2. He's got an entire province. He's got one of the strongest campaign starts in the game for a reason. Then he wipes out Krakadrak, and then he comes for you. So Frot, Trog, Azazel, all in a package that is certain. It is absolutely certain that you're going to end up dealing with them. What may also happen, and this is really where things get elevated from a hard campaign start to a genuinely hellish one, is that to the south you have Draika. The AI is predisposed against you as a player. Draika has the strongest early game army in the entire game. She's got ranged units. Yeah, hers are a bit weaker, but they're still Wood Elven ranged units. And she's got Lore of Shadows. She's got magic. She's got magic that affects your leadership in particular. She's got fear and terror, so your entire army can break. And she has heavily armored units that you don't really have a counter for if you are playing Katarin, because the only thing you can recruit for quite a few turns are these Kossars, which the game itself says they're weak against armor. Quite plainly, if Draika sends a full stack against you, you're not going to be able to win that battle unless you cheese it in some way. Maybe you get her pinned down in a minor settlement and you win it because the AI is really bad and the attacker has all the advantages in that kind of situation. That's the only kind of situation you'd be able to win against Draika, and that you'd be able to wipe her out. Oh, even better, Asland may declare war against you because it doesn't have the best relations with you. There's a reason why Katarin, when you play any other legendary lord, Katarin ends up taking some portions of Asland. That's because they don't have good relations. There's also Festus, though generally I haven't seen him march on Kislev itself, though he may very well decide to do that. Or take over the entirety of the Empire. Then there's Azag. Azag, a greenskin lord, declares a war on you. Declares a war on you, comes for you, descends from the mountains, not with one stack, with 2 bloody stacks. So yeah, you have 3 major problems to the north in Frot, Azazel, and Trog. You have a powerful faction that a faction that starts with quite a lot of units, 2 armies, 2 individual armies with mammoths and Norscan ice trolls from the very start, 1 in each army. You have to fight 3 minor settlement battles. You have to deal with all of this. And then to cap it all off, Azag is quite very likely to come down from the mountains, descend on you with not just 1 stack of troops, with 2 stacks of troops, because he's going to declare a war either on you or on someone else, but he's going to descend on you with 40 units on your ass. And you struggle to maintain more than 20. That is hell itself. Can you deal with it? Yeah, you can. I mean, you can win any challenge if you put your mind to it, but this is genuinely the hardest campaign start by far. Like, you get many of the issues the other guys have, like a slow start, a weak starting army, playing a faction that may be stronger if it is allowed to grow, because that's exactly what Kislev is in a nutshell. And what's even worse is the invocations themselves. To win the supporter race, and really get these benefits, and you want these benefits for the control leadership, and leadership in particular. The speed doesn't matter that much, but the control leadership is quite essential, I'd say, because your Cossars don't have the best leadership, and having control, even as Katarin, who gets 6 control, is quite important. The problem with invocations is you need devotion for them. How do you gain devotion? Well, you gain devotion through 2 main ways. There's 3 ways, but 2 main ways. One is to fight battles against chaos factions. Marauder, Norska, Warriors of Chaos, Demons of Chaos. You are at war with the Norskan faction, but when you're dealing with Azag, Draika, Trot, Trog, Azazel, yeah, you're not going to get devotion for fighting those battles. And you start with enough devotion to build, to use 1 invocation. Invocation of Urson. The cost of the invocation also goes up the more settlements you hold. So that is already an issue. And you need to invoke these to gain supporters. Like, you need to invoke the gods to be able to gain supporters. Urson is the best because he gives you 5 supporters when occupying a settlement. So you really, really want to have that. That's the best one you can go for. These invocations last 10 turns. The problem is the devotion is not just used for invocations that you need for supporters. They're also used to get churches. The churches are important because they give you more supporters, 1 each, but also because a level 2 church will grant you a patriarch. And you do want patriarchs. They are good heroes, but you're having to spend your special campaign resource to get the building for them. And you don't start with enough to invoke a god and build a church. That is the bad aspect about this. The really bad aspect about this. If you can stabilize the situation and get going as Kislev, it isn't too bad in the mid-late game, but early on, as Katarin in particular, though it's not necessarily that much better as Kastalten, but as Katarin in particular, it is a hellish experience. Just a note on Kastalten, he is in a much, much better situation. He doesn't have the same control benefits as Katarin does, but he does get a significant ward save and leadership bonus for Cossars. Ward save for Patriarchs, leadership for Cossars, and he starts with a Patriarch. And he also starts with 2 Strelts units that are much better than anything you start, except the Ice Guards. But he has 2 units, you have 1. So yeah, Kastalten has a much better situation. He has a much better starting army than you do. And on top of that, he can neutralize Azazel very, very quickly by declaring war on him, having him come down here before he wipes out the Brotherhood of the Bear. As I've said, take Azazel out. It is a hard battle, but it's just that 1 hard battle. And then he has all the tools and capabilities needed to deal with fraud. Also, he starts with a level 2 settlement. That gives him some significant benefits. You start with a level 1 settlement. Who do you think is in a better position? Yeah, it's Kastalten. Let alone the situation of Boris. It says a lot about Katarin's situation, or even Kastalten's situation, that the one Kislev faction that starts in the best position is Boris Ursus, who starts with no settlement whatsoever. But here's the thing about Boris. You take this tower, you get a bunch of units, you spend 2 turns global recruiting, local recruiting, then you leave, you come here for the mountains, you take this entire province, and you've helped you've taken a lot of territory, but you've also helped stabilize the entire situation of Kislev, because Prague then won't be overwhelmed by Norskans. You can help them out. Then you can deal with Frat, Trog, Azazel, and Katarin. The AI Katarin, all she's gonna do is hold Azag and Draika in check, which she can do. It's not the easiest thing, but she can do it. So if you're playing Boris, you have a much better situation than the other 2. Kastalten is the second best, Katarin is the worst by far. Like, I could easily include Kastalten on this list as well, but it doesn't compare. At least he starts with a Patriarch and some better units in his army, and he has the tools necessary, or the starting position necessary, to at least deal with some of the legendary lords that are going to plague your campaign, regardless of whether or not you're playing Kastalten or Katarin. And the difference is, Kastalten doesn't have to deal with the issues from the south. He just has to deal with the 3 legendary lords in the north. He doesn't have to deal with 2, maybe 3 legendary lords, and maybe Osland as well, coming in from the south. Therein lies the difference. That's why Katarin is in such a horrible situation. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.